the fear and the anxiety in the city was palpable. I remember as probably a 3 or 4-year-old being told, if bombs start, I had a bedroom and I had a bed, and in these homes they had built little bunkers, let's just say, like a little space underneath the beds. And I was told that if you hear bombs falling on the house at night, you need to get out of bed and crawl underneath your bed, just in case things start collapsing on top of you. So, as a 3 or 4-year-old being told that as you're being tucked into bed, that you have to listen for the bombs. I couldn't sleep, of course, as a kid, and that neurologic programming lasted my entire life. I could not, sleeping at night was something that was hard to do, to fall asleep. And so I became a night owl, which is natural. It was fitting for becoming a doctor that did night shifts and things like that.
All right, and we are back with the Wisdom Matrix, a watering hole for the intersectionality of ancient wisdom and modern life. And we are so thrilled to have our wonderful guest, Christian Lay, with us today. Welcome to the Wisdom Matrix podcast.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to this conversation.
And I'm sure the listeners will have a brief bio of some of your life experience. But I just want to say, because Matti and I had a great pre-interview call with you, and I walked away feeling incredibly inspired by the conversation. And I've had some time to integrate like why that is. And I remember going just directly to my wife, Danny, and being like, this guy is incredible. Like to me, you represent an aspect of our society, culture, and world at like the leading edge of a wave of consciousness that is both the medical and professional side of healing and modalities that are integrating a lot of ancient wisdom practices with modern tools and quantum physics and an understanding of what this human experience is. And I just haven't met that many people who have such like a sharp and acute, let's call it a diagnosis of what's happening with people in the world right now and why it's so important to be having these conversations. So thank you for, the work that you do. And thank you for bringing your voice and advocating for all that is good. And just really excited to further explore this conversation.
Thank you so much. I appreciate those words. But I'll say this, that really I've just been a subject, the material reality we exist in. I was cast into a certain karmic role as a kid born in the middle of a war in Asia and traversing across the globe to end up as a refugee in the United States and going through, an indoctrinated upbringing until life itself bumped me up against a lot of the challenges of your mind, the ego-driven personality that we have to create to exist in this indoctrinated, form of living. And I'm grateful that I was bounced and bumped against hard walls of the ego so that it could cause my own awakening. And so I'm actually just absolutely grateful that I made these discoveries by total accident, but also through suffering. The challenges of life is what helped me wake up. And once I had my wake up, as somebody who cares about other human beings, which is why I became a doctor, you can't help but want to pass on these things that wake you up.
Well, a huge shout out to the karmic casting director who put you in that role, because it's going really well.
Yeah, and you're living the dream for a lot of people, and splitting time between Costa Rica and beautiful Oregon coastline. So it's that's a dream I think many people aspire to. So congratulations on figuring out how to exist in a couple amazing places.
Thank you. Pure blessing. I'm just completely blessed.
Christian, let's just take a moment to go back to those early indoctrinations, if you will. You mentioned growing up in war and then becoming an immigrant in the United States, which I'm sure came with its own challenges and stereotypes. And then I believe you also grew up Catholic, which had some probably pros and cons on who Christian grew up to be. So talk a little bit about those experiences. And I would also just love to hear, though, like what's the wisdom that you gleaned from your childhood and from growing up in a war-torn country and as an immigrant and in the Catholic Church?
I would say that my life journey of learning started even before, even the war itself. My folks came together and had me at a very early phase of their life. My mom was 18. My dad was already 30, and they weren't together after I was born. So that's, karma challenge number one. To be an infant without a mom in the house, and for about 2 years before she came back into my life and raised me. And the relationship had its conflicts, and then the war was starting to end. So the desperation and the terror of the South Vietnamese people, especially Saigon, as the war approached, as the battle lines approached, and as it was clear that the South was going to fall. And so the fear and the anxiety in the city was palpable. I remember as probably a 3 or 4-year-old being told, if bombs start, I had a bedroom, and I had a bed, and in these homes they had built little bunkers, let's just say, like a little space underneath the beds. And I was told that if you hear bombs falling on the house at night, you need to get out of bed and crawl underneath your bed, just in case things start collapsing on top of you. So, as a 3 or 4-year-old being told that as you're being tucked into bed, that you have to listen for the bombs, I couldn't sleep, of course, as a kid, and that neurologic programming lasted my entire life. I could not, sleeping at night was something that was hard to do, to fall asleep, and so I became a night owl, which is natural. It was fitting for becoming a doctor that did night shifts and things like that. But that's how my experience started in life. Was the experience of the war, and also seeing bloodshed as the war ended. One of the stories I share with people, and it's shocking, but it was just part of my upbringing, was being in a market with my dad and some commotion happening, and a military officer, a police officer, had captured somebody who was being accused of being a spy for the North, and he was executed on the spot. There was no juries, no judging, no trials, and then everybody ran. And so that memory was put into my brain very clearly at a young age. That was about 4.5 or something like that. The war officially ended in 1975. And of course, there was just mass chaos. I remember lots of chaos in the city. We lived kind of right outside central Saigon, and so that was that was my initial, let's just say, psychological loads that I inherited at a young age. And in '76, my dad was able to apply for us to leave the country with visas to be accepted by the French government. My mom was part French, and there was an agreement between the French and the Vietnamese that anybody of French descendants, because they had been, the colonizing country prior to the Americans being present there, French descendants and their immediate family members were allowed to leave the country and go to France. So we were lucky that we didn't have to escape like a lot of my relatives had to, which was a very treacherous and dangerous journey to try to escape the country at the time. And so that was the first chapter of life up until age 6. We left in 1976 for France, and were received there and spent about 3 years in France before finally coming to the States in 1979.
Christian, where in Florida was your cousin, or who was
uncle?
Yeah,
my aunt, my dad's younger sister, family. We landed in Sarasota, Florida.
Okay.
And we were with them for about 6 to 8 months, I think, living in their home before my folks found a place in Bradenton, Florida. And so that was I want to say like the first, year of my life in the United States was there in Bradenton, south of Sarasota, a little bit, south of Tampa, Florida. Eventually, we relocated to South Florida, kind of outside of Pompano Beach, which is just one beach up from Fort Lauderdale.
Yeah. Yeah. Travis and
Yep.
Josh are both down in Florida in the Jupiter kind of Palm Beach County area. So,
Mm-hmm.
And what was the reason why you didn't stay in France, or was the idea always kind of more go through France, get to the United States?
Yeah, well, actually, yeah, my dad thought that was going to be our new home. He, he grew up during the era in Vietnam where the French were there. He learned French as a second language. He loved the French culture. He read French literature and art, and loved the French culture. And obviously, we had an automatic ticket to get out of the country through my mom, who was part French. And when we lived there, my dad went from being, again, my dad's got a whole chapter in himself, but he grew up very poor outside of Saigon, down in the Delta, Mekong Delta, out in the villages. I mean, he grew up in a home that was a dirt floor with like palm fronds for roofs, and was able to climb out of poverty and become, self-educated, and then educated as an engineer in Vietnam, and then eventually was actually in the first couple of years of med school in Saigon when the war ended, and he was also had become one of the chairmen of the Bank of Vietnam as well. And so he climbed really out of a very deep hole to a very, lofty position in life there before the war ended, and then lost everything. Everything was taken. We were considered of this upper class, the bourgeoisie, the North Vietnamese said, and you had everything taken from you, and they made sure you were at the bottom. And so anyways, he went to France and had to start over, and was, working as a driver and as, personal assistant and things like that. And after a while, what he told me why he didn't want to keep us there was, and we lived some cool places, refugee housing that they had, apartment buildings and so forth. But at one point we were down the street, right down from the L'Arc de Triomphe, this beautiful, place in Paris. And but he felt that he could see right away that the French culture clearly had an upper ceiling. The French could get here and continue, but everybody else is going to stop here. And he felt that he wanted us to grow up in a place where there was no upper limits on what we could do with our lives, and he felt that the United States was that place.
Yeah, I mean that's an issue the French are dealing with now, and it's creating a lot of issues. It's I think it's a unique. I'm half Finnish, and so I spent kind of half my life growing up in Finland, and so have kind of the European perspective along with the American perspective. And it's hard, as Europe has let in a lot of immigrants, which to a certain extent is great, right? But there is that ceiling and differentiation that you don't have in the United States, especially as a country of immigrants. And so a lot of the European countries are grappling with that now, because it really does limit the opportunities for immigrants in a lot of those countries, and then that just creates a lot of challenges kind of societally. So
yeah, it's that I've looked at that a lot too, because I am an immigrant, and I'm seeing the immigration crisis happening here as well as in Europe. And I think it's a multi-layered issue. It's not straightforward. It's not simple. Immigration, like I said, you got to have multiple levels of thinking about it, because there is a level in which unrestricted immigration is very destructive to a culture, to a country or society. Not all cultures mix well together, obviously, because we're animals still at our core. We're tribalistic, we're pack animals, and so we have to just honor that that's true in our literal genetics and neurology, in conjunction with our higher consciousness of wanting to create more goodness in the world across all cultures, right? So yeah, that's a whole nother
Yeah, there's a lot
podcast.
there. There's a lot to unpack. One question that I have that just from, and you were obviously very young when you left Vietnam, but from like coming from the East to the West, and obviously you have a really interesting background in being a medical doctor, and then the work you've done on kind of from a spiritual standpoint, and with a lot of the modalities that we'll get into, is like, how do you feel like that origin coming from the East has potentially even maybe influenced just the openness to to various wisdom traditions or belief systems that are unique to you because of that background?
I think that jumping back to Josh's first question about the Catholic upbringing and so forth, in conjunction to your question, is this: that yes, Vietnamese culture and lots of Southeast Asia is a very harmonious mixture of Catholicism, which was brought in by the French primarily, okay, the colonial French import, and a long-term culture of Buddhism. But the interesting thing about like Vietnam in particular is Buddhists and Christians live completely together, no problems, there's no conflicts at all. I have family members that are serious Buddhists and serious Catholics, and they're fine together. There's even husband and wives that one's a Buddhist and one's a Catholic, and it's all okay. I'm not going to mince words or step on eggshells. I'm just going to tell you my honest opinion is, as you know, something like 80-90% of people who practice any kind of organized religion do so from a more superficial level of understanding, or let's just say spiritual understanding of spiritual practice. It's more of like this is my football team, this is my outfit, this is my hat,
a safety
and I
blanket.
do this thing, I show up, I because I'm a good person, this is what I do, but is there like are you sitting and like pondering the question of God and existence? Not really, right? So that's the premise from which a lot of my, let's just say, spiritual or religious indoctrination around me, that's how it looked to me. I got dragged to Catholic church, Vietnamese priests. I'm like a 5-year-old, 6-year-old level vocabulary, Vietnamese vocabulary, and so the priest is speaking at a adult level. I'm sitting there for an hour plus, just bored out of my mind in church, because I don't understand what's really being said, but I have to go, or I'm going to get in trouble. So that was the basis from which I was exposed to religion. And then, of course, moving to 2 different cultures consecutively too, what that did for me was blow my mind open to the bigness, the largeness of life and cultures. And so I think that by the time I became a 9, 10, 11-year-old kid in Florida growing up, it was already in me that things are a lot bigger than they appear. That what my parents grew up with, my relatives and so forth, is bigger than that. And then of course meeting friends from the United States, friend in schools, and whatever their beliefs, religious or not, I realized like we only see a little piece of it if we come from just one place and one kind of upbringing. If you move to a couple of different places, you see like, wow, reality is actually different. It's a different reality. Like the jokes are different, the entertainment's different, everything is actually slightly different. We're not like all the same. We're not all coexisting in the exact same reality. Is what I wouldn't have been able to put it in those words when I was a kid, but I just realized it's a lot bigger than what it appears to most people. That, I think that was the opening for me. That was actually the opening to really searching for God at a very early age. It wasn't really for God. It was like, what is the meaning of life?
The meaning
It became a question like really early. I don't know why. I can still remember, obviously there were traumas in my journey into the United States. There were traumas that I think that's how we start questioning meaning of life. Is we have to go through some kind of a struggle, or if you're lucky, it was some glorious like epiphany or an experience that was so glorious that it like made you go into that question at a young age. For me, it was probably all the challenges and things like that. But I'll still remember, it's probably one of my earliest spiritual awakenings that I didn't know was a spiritual awakening, was as a 12-year-old kid laying on the hood of my dad's car in Florida, looking up at the stars one night. I just had a fascination with stars and planets and moons from a very early age, and was laying there looking at them, and in a weird moment, in a split second, I can still see it right now. I stopped seeing the stars is kind of like this movie theater screen of like a bunch of dots of lights, and I saw the whole thing in 3 dimensions. I could see with my mind that the smaller lights were further away and the bigger ones were closer. I could see that dimensionality. I don't know what it was about seeing the 3 dimensionalness of this blanket of stars that just opened something. It just opened something where I started questioning, what is this all about? What's that out there and what's this in here was the question. It was like, there's all this stuff out there I don't understand, and there's all this stuff in here and I don't understand. And that was really, I think, the beginning for me of that questioning of reality and of life. And God, what is God? What is consciousness? Why am I having these thoughts in my mind? It was very interesting.
Yeah, not to like oversimplify these deep karmic grooves that you had to climb out of from such an early age. Like you said, these chapters of your life can be novels in and of themselves. But what I'm hearing from you is, man, the perspective growing up in Vietnam and then spending a little bit of time in France and then coming to the United States, of like the perspective that you got to experience of 3 very different cultures at that time, and the empathy that probably created within you, and the awareness of something larger is going on here, because the way that the Vietnamese are operating is very different from the French, which is very different from people in the United States. And I just imagine that it really, like you said, it brought that question of like, who are we and what are we doing here front and center for you, because you kind of got to peek behind the curtain, so to say, of 3 different cultures at such a young age in your life. So kind of amazing.
Well, I think what it was, like if you grow up in a place and a culture consistently, you get grounded in that reality. You're grounded in the reality, which is, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But I think my existence was completely ungrounded. I was ungrounded from the moment I was born, through the war, into the French culture, into the United. Like there was no landing. There was no landing and putting roots down where I would have perhaps solidified a perspective that I would have said, this is reality. This is all of reality, with a lot of assurance. I couldn't. I didn't have the opportunity to actually put my roots down. And so I think as a result, I was kind of, it felt confusing, to be honest with you. It felt scary and confusing. There was a lot of anxiety in my being, obviously. I grew up with anxiety, obviously. Listening for bombs makes you anxious. That in itself, I think, created the opening for these questions. So that's why I don't really give myself credit for figuring anything out. I'm more like, oh, I was put into a position to have these experiences that led to these realizations. And so, yes, I did some work, but I also was just kind of put in a position to experience that,
And was that, so that experience, is that what kind of drew you to medicine, in terms of just really understanding kind of how the components kind of all work together and fit? In addition, potentially, of your father having been, going down that path as well, what was the kind of the instinct around medicine that drew you in that direction?
A couple of more decades to even happen. I'll tell you how it started. I still remember also watching on black and white TV with rabbit ears in the 1970s, when there used to be only like 5 channels on TV, PBS, CBS, whatever, and everything shut off at midnight. You got that.
Yeah, it was like Sesame Street and something
I don't know
else.
if I don't know, other than Matti, I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember that, but man, I remember watching when I was just starting to learn English. It was maybe 2 years into being in the States, so it was by 11. There was a PBS show. It was one of those, anti-drug documentaries, and I still they had a guy in a wheelchair, and there was a speaker that was saying, this man took his first and only hit of acid, and now he's sitting here like this, and I'm like, holy shit. I remember it worked on me, because I was from that moment on, drugs to me, nobody needed to tell me not to do drugs, because I saw that and I'm like, holy cow, I would never touch any of that stuff, you know?
Yeah.
So man, growing up, drugs, and I had no idea, drugs to me was, you're gonna, fry your brain and be dumb. So I was actually, not interested at all. Although by the time I was 14 or 15, I tried marijuana. The same cousin, the same cousin, we became best buddies. He lived up actually in Gainesville. Would come down every summer, and he was, kind of like the bad boy cousin, and he'd bring me a little pot to try, and it was psychedelic for me back then. I remember one of my favorite memories was he left me just a little tiny bit of pot, and I smoked it on a Friday night. And one of the rock stations down there, every Friday night they would play a whole half album. And I remember listening to Pink Floyd for the first time, high on pot. And, yeah, I closed my eyes, and I swear it was so psychedelic. So that was really my first, kind of willingness to try anything, but I figured this is natural, so I'm feeling pretty safe with it. But that was as much as I was interested in, and it actually led to probably my second major spiritual experience, which was I started surfing when I was like 13 years old in Florida, down there in Deerfield Beach, which the waves were terrible most of the year. We just surfed really crappy wind chop waves. But I remember going out surfing by myself one day, and I was the only person in the water because the waves were tiny. Nobody was bothering, but I just was so in love with being out in the ocean. And I remember a huge thunderstorm dumping rain so hard that I was maybe, 50 feet off the beach, and the rain was coming down so hard that I couldn't even see shore. It was just pure rain all around me, and hitting the water. And I dropped into a complete conscious stillness and presence in that moment. It felt like I was in the presence of something very powerful, very holy in that moment. That stuck with me to this day. It was like a very, very potent experience in my life to somehow accidentally, because of what was going on around me, drop into such a state of complete presence in the moment that I felt like I was connected to something that was talking to me or communicating with me on some deep level. So that was kind of, the second pretty profound experience for me, besides looking at the stars. And then if you fast forward a little bit more about that experience, I went through my 20s, becoming a med student and a resident and then a doctor, and started some pretty a major entrepreneurial startup that became successful very quickly, and then so on and so forth, relationships and life and so forth. By my mid-30s, living in Santa Cruz, California, I was running a department for Monterey Community Hospital out there, and I was just too busy of a doctor and medical director to use cannabis. But if I did, I would on the weekends smoke a little bit, and I would go to the driving range about 15 minutes away from my house to hit golf balls, and that was kind of my meditation, my relaxation. And I had also I decided that my mind was so busy and constant that I couldn't relax in my personal life, and I decided I need to practice meditation. That coincided, the meditation practice, serious meditation practice. I was listening to Adyashanti. He's a kind of a former Zen guy, became more of a Eastern meditation teacher in the Santa Cruz area. And I started doing meditation practice, and then in conjunction, I think, with cannabis, let's just say it opened a door of consciousness where I was receiving downloads that were just radically life-changing for me on many levels, not just intellectually, but from a heart level, from a deep person feeling level, which was something that I had difficult connecting with because my upbringing was so traumatic that I, learned to put a very tough shell on my heart, my sense of feeling, my sense of vulnerability, my emotions. I couldn't cry, handled everything difficult in life like a doctor handling a trauma case. As a doctor, you can't feel emotion. You have to stay on point. The amount of information you have to digest and the accuracy of what you have to put out to save a life was so intense. So, you know, it's like running computer code. You have to like be on point. And so the combination of that lifestyle of being this technician of the body, and not just technician, but in a life-saving role, you know, anything from the emergency room into the hospital ward, into the ICU, I was responsible for. And so it was like constant life-saving interventions. And so I kind of handled my soul that way. I handled my emotion that way. I handled my relationships that way. I handled myself that way. You know, if I was having a hard time, I just, you know, you're gonna just analyze this. And the combination of the cannabis with meditation just led to a very significant moment of an opening in me. I think into my heart mind, because I do believe that we have multiple areas of consciousness, not just this one up here that is primary analytical, what I call the biological computer, designed for survival, you know, analysis and synthesis of data to generate success in survival at the physical level, food, sex, and comfort, housing, whatever. And then now we're using it to also survive socially, because as you know, if you're not social, people die in that way too. They're dying psychologically. So we also have to create strategies for success in the social survival of modern humanity as well. That was the process that had started opening to me was cannabis opening doors of perception. You know, what I realized was that I could use a little bit of cannabis and sit and ponder something, and for the first time I could take a topic that was complex, and it felt like in my mind I could lift it off a page and turn it into a three-dimensional object in my mind. And so I can go look around it, all aspects of it that I hadn't seen before. And those aspects were more feeling based than mind based, whether it was the difficult, complex relationship with my father, or my relationship at the time, or with work. I could start seeing things more than just the intellectual analysis of things. I could see them from a feeling space, and I could start feeling much more empathic. Essentially, I could start to more easily feel other people's feelings that I was responsible for creating. Probably one of the most profound things, third profound thing, you know, as I go through my review of my life, was I had a moment exactly like that, where I was driving over the crest of a highway on the way to hit some golf balls in this part of Monterey Bay, between Aptos, the little town of Aptos, right in the bluffs overlooking the ocean below Santa Cruz, to Watsonville, where the driving range was. I crested over this highway where you can see the whole Monterey Bay, and the sun was out there and it was reflecting off the ocean. It was just like a sea of stars, and it was a gorgeous blue California day. And I remember in that moment, an unbelievable download had happened, like instantly in my mind. It wasn't even a second. It was like instant understanding. I had a very difficult childhood with my dad. My dad went through incredible suffering himself, and as a result, passed on a lot of that into me. You know, a lot of verbal violence, a lot of physical violence. And can you imagine, like, a man escaping a country with his wife and little children, little babies even, and then trying to get to the United States, and then experience a lot of like mistreatment as a refugee, you know, a lot of racism thrown against him. And he had climbed out of poverty to become very successful in his country, and now he's like treated like dirt. You know, was having a very difficult time speaking a third language that he had to learn, English language. All that was coming through him, you know. So I was kind of like the dog that you kick at home when you came home really frustrated and tired and you've been taking abuse all day. You know, I had a hard time with my dad. My dad and I, you know, obviously, when I went off to college and med school, we kind of became estranged for a while, and had a difficult dynamic, obviously. And man, the most amazing thing happened. I went from being in that state to a split second later being in a completely different state of mind around my dad. This transmission that had come through while I was driving the car and looking at the ocean had just a little bit of cannabis, and I was just letting my mind do its, you know, kind of like not think, but just be completely open, waiting to just go hit golf balls. And I got this download that came through so fast. A vision, my dad abusing me physically, knowing too, and then seeing right away, right next to that, his father, who was an alcoholic, beating him and abusing him and talking down to him. And then it showed me, because I knew that story, but then it showed me my great-grandfather doing that to my grandfather, and my great-great-grandfather doing that to him, and back and back and back. And then it zoomed right back into me, and it was like a question. Now you have the heirloom. Are you going to pass it on? So it was like man, it was so powerful. I didn't conceive of it. My mind did not conceive of that. It was just some kind of a transmission that came through that showed me crystal clear that there was a karmic lineage inheritance that got passed on and on and on. And now it's in my hands and I get to decide what I'm going to do with it. Man, I started crying, first of all, because there was such a clear sense of forgiveness for my dad. You know, I literally picked up the phone while I was the drive. Like I started crying and I picked up the phone back in the flip phone era. I called my dad, got him on the phone, and I said, Dad, I just realized something. I just want to tell you I forgive you for everything. All that stuff I was so mad with you about. I don't feel upset with you at all anymore. And my dad cried for the first time on the phone with me. That never happened before. And so that, man, how do you explain something like that? You know, how do you explain an experience like that and a resolution and an enlightenment, an awakening that happens in a split second without you even trying to solve a problem? And so that experience at 35 years of age was what actually started my real search for returning to my search that I started in my teens, right? Like, what is life about? What is God? What is existence? It returned me back because I'd spent those 20 years just doing the material life thing, you know, getting a career and making money and building programs and whatever, you know. It was that experience that really said to me, oh man, there's that journey that you started. You need to keep going. You need to keep going. And so that was the beginning of my opening. And if you've been on the medicine journey and you really dig into it on this level of allowing this possibility of a much greater consciousness that's actually in control and driving all of this and giving us information here and there, giving us challenges here and there, that if we're open to this idea that life, if you want to call it God, whatever you want to call it, is actually orchestrating things, you know, by giving our individual packets of consciousness little signals, little intuitions, little guidance, that there's something greater at work that starts to fall into place, you know, because from that moment on, things started falling into place that was almost like something was guiding me along. Because the next thing that happened was I walked into the Santa Cruz bookstore, which is a well-known, famous place in Santa Cruz, been around forever. And I was walking around just looking at books. I wasn't really a reader, but I was with my partner at the time and she loved to read. So I would, you know, just walking. And on a kind of clearance table was a very interesting little tiny book. I didn't have time to read books. I was too busy like reading charts and like, you know, writing reports for the hospital CEO and stuff. Didn't have time to read books. But there was a thin little book and I don't know why I picked it up. The title was Higher Wisdom. And it said 13 essays from notable people in the psychedelic. And it was like $1 or something. I'm like, oh, looks interesting. I'll buy this, you know, just for fun. It was profound. I picked up this book and it was like 13 essays from like Albert Hoffman and Stanley Groff and all the early psychedelic era. Some, you know, the Secret Chief. I don't know if you guys know about the Secret Chief. He was a psychologist that started doing underground psychedelic therapy work with people in the 1960s and had thousands and thousands of people. And he had to keep a obviously very secretive status of doing that. And he was actually in the North California Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, doing it for decades, underground psychedelic therapy very successfully. And he was also feeding guys like Stanley Groff and all these like academic guys with that knowledge about the use of psychedelics with case reports and observational data collection that informed a lot of those guys so that they could kind of route their research, you know, with real data and help a lot of those guys develop their thinkings and ideas around consciousness studies, honestly. And so anyways, there were profound little essays. I don't remember all their names anymore, but one was a college professor who studied a particular slice of history of early Europe, and he particularly studied military strategies of different Napoleon and various individuals, and him describing how he took LSD and was able to lay down and see all of the historical data that he had put in his brain for a lifetime, synthesize theories and concepts that were extremely deep and detailed that he came out of, and was able to write these papers that became very famous in their particular academic study of military strategies of that era, and so on and so forth. And likewise, another was a architect who was given a very difficult, complex architectural project to design for the builder, and he was, like a team of them were trying to overcome this design problem. And he likewise, I want to say, did mushrooms. And he said that in his experience for the 6 hours, he closed his eyes and the whole building was built in his mind. And he walked inside of it and around of it for hours. And he looked at all the architectural designs that would overcome his design problems that he couldn't solve. He saw all of it. And if he needed to change things, he could just move things around in his mind and it would literally change. And then he came back out and he drafted his entire design, and it was solved the architectural design. It was just so many, these 13 essays were so fascinating because it gave me a complete different understanding of what I learned from that PBS documentary, which is drugs, you're getting high, it's going to mess you up. It was the first time I had ever read anything to suggest that you could use these substances to actually advance humankind, right? That it wasn't just for entertainment purposes. These guys all despised Timothy Leary. They felt like Timothy Leary and those guys came in and just like, they screwed it up for everybody by promoting this, party style use of psychedelics, was brought all this heavy conservative, the conservative American values back at the time.
Yeah. Well, and amazingly, I mean, and I think the bookstore that you were in is probably the bookstore that I'm thinking of, because I've been to Santa Cruz. I grew up in Santa Barbara, but I remember about 5 years ago, I was in Santa Cruz. I was actually up in Monterey, and I was there with a group, and I had some time in Santa Cruz. I went to this really cool tea house. But then I went into this bookstore that I think's been there for a very long time, and it had the most amazing section on. I mean, I think for basically the whole place was all about spirituality, but I mean, a huge section on psychedelics, and like some of just the coolest books that I'd ever seen. A lot of stuff that I hadn't been exposed to, and it just you were lucky to be in that place at that time, because I mean the resources kind of within probably a 60-90 mile radius of Santa Cruz is probably you were able to tap into a lot once that awakening occurred, I would guess.
The funny thing is, like, I didn't know that until I moved away from Santa Cruz, and when I was deep into my psychedelic experience, before I realized that Santa Cruz is like one of the like meccas,
the epicenter
of psychedelic therapy going on. I never met anybody or was exposed to anybody, but I'll tell you what happened after I read that book. Something lit a fire in my mind, because besides full-time job working as a doctor, running a department for a hospital, every night I was on the computer doing just research, looking up, this is back in the old days of the internet, where you have to go to forums and like really dig to find information. And I just looked for every source possible for anything related to psychedelics. And I remember reading a trip report. It probably was this Arrowwood website, if you've ever heard of it. It's an really old, one of the original websites, arrowwood.org, that provided, trip reports, but also safety and lots of like legal information about various substances, you know. But I remember reading a trip report about somebody had come back from Peru drinking ayahuasca. And when I read it, and he gave it in excruciating detail, all the purging, and I read it, and I knew in that moment. I remember turning to my partner in bed and saying, I'm gonna drink this stuff one day. I don't know how or when, but one day I'm gonna drink this stuff. I want to know what this guy experienced. And that was so that was in the, I would say 36 years old. I was 36. I don't think I drank ayahuasca for another 10 years. Yeah.
Christian, staying on, because I certainly love
Yeah,
talking
yeah,
about ayahuasca,
please.
but to stay on cannabis for a moment.
Yeah.
Like I likewise had a similar indoctrination to yourself, where I was stone cold sober until 30 years old, and then cannabis was the first plant, substance, drug, as some people would identify it as, that I communed with, and it was absolutely amazing. Now, I feel like I have a very healthy relationship with cannabis because I hadn't been introduced to it until 30 years old, and there's a certain level of development and maturity that occurs before that. And in the last 5 years, I'm 35 now, I certainly am aware that Mama J can be quite slippery or seductive. And often in some of the men's work that I do, I help men recalibrate their relationship to marijuana. And so I'm just curious from your perspective, especially being a medical doctor, cannabis being so accessible, right? It's recreational in probably half the states in this country. And there's just such a tortured history, misunderstanding, but of abuse as well. How do you maintain a healthy relationship with cannabis if you still have a relationship with her? Or how do you recommend other people work with cannabis that's in a healthy, intentional way?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Well, you know, if you saw my bio, I devoted like 18 years of my life
Right.
in the work of cannabis. Um, I will start by saying what the indigenous people of South America have said about cannabis. They, you know, obviously see things from a spiritual perspective, and I think it's so accurate, so accurate. They describe cannabis as having two faces. And number one, it's a feminine energy, in their opinion.
Yeah.
It's a feminine type of consciousness energy. And she has two faces. On one side, she's the healer teacher. And on the other side, she's the seductress. The seductress isn't necessarily all bad, okay? The seductress is, you know, the enjoyment of life, you know, food, music, sex, whatever, you know, the hedonistic parts of ourselves that need that. We need those things, you know, to make life interesting and pleasurable. But the seductress can also take you into a very, very dark place, because that whole of hedonism goes really deep and it goes really dark. And so you have, you know, the indigenous people for thousands of years have always held a lot of respect for cannabis because of its power, for good or for bad. And so, you know, that's my true perspective. Scientifically speaking, all the way through spiritually speaking, is how you have to regard cannabis. It's tricky, right? Because now it's open and available and accepted. When I got into cannabis work in cannabinoid sciences and research and study, I was idealistic in thinking that, oh, you know, these scientific discoveries and findings, these clinical results are going to lead to the government changing the rules and the laws and the research and opening funding, and so that we can really take advantage of the benefits of these compounds. The opposite has happened, interestingly, which is that it's actually primarily 95% promoting the use of recreational enjoyment of cannabis, no different than opening liquor stores.
Yeah,
You know,
just the
cannabis is
seductive
really
part.
being
Yeah.
used as a entertainment option. You know, is a you know, entertainment option, and that's exactly. And so every single state that has opened it up, including the state of Oregon, where I started my work here, billions of dollars of tax revenue, not one penny has been given to medical research, or even, let's say, drug recovery counseling, addiction counseling. Not a penny has been spent in the billions of dollars of tax revenues to promote the actual medical use of cannabis, even though it's called a medical marijuana program. Not a dollar has gone into medical anything. And that's, I think, true virtually for every other state that has a medical marijuana program. Okay, recreational, that's just, okay, we're going to open liquor stores. We're going to let you sell liquor. I mean, take that the way it is. And obviously at the federal level, yeah, we've heard this, recent rescheduling, and that's great. Once the money starts flowing and once the research actually gets done, I'll believe it. I've been trying to believe for, 18 years, and it really hasn't moved. That's because there's powerful financial interests that don't want to see these compounds, which cannot be patented, into highly profitable drugs. Clearly, cannabis, 5,000 years at least of history. There was a Emperor Shennong of the dynasty of China opened a school of cannabis medicine 5,000 years ago. I mean, it was, they were already studying it for the scientific properties. There's been a long history of it being a valuable medical option. Up until the early 1900s in this country, every doctor, with their doctor's bag that would do house call, everybody had a tincture of cannabis in their doctor's bag. They used it for a variety of things, pain, anxiety, childbirth, you name it. It was a standard thing, like as if you had a bottle of aspirin. And that history has been completely censored from the American mind ever since the drug war era started, and was promoted by DuPont. The DuPonts, who were, among the first, and Rockefeller, among the first oil barons, because, and they took over the medical education system and silenced the Chinese medicine, acupuncture, all the traditional medicines got turned into voodoo medicine, cannabis as well. You read the history of cannabis, you'll see the whole political, financial chess games that have been played against cannabis, which was primarily against hemp, really, because they wanted to outlaw hemp in the United States.
So like reefer madness era, even really
yeah, that
that.
came. Yeah, the reefer madness was just like a psychological operation against the public to just scare them against cannabis, but really that was just an attack vector to basically make hemp illegal, because hemp could replace the cotton industry, a lot of the oil production industry, a lot of the fiber and materials industry, which were owned by Rockefellers and DuPonts, would have been very damaged by hemp being made into a mass produced product. Which, by the way, the founding colonists of the United States, the colonists that established the early states, our primary agricultural product was hemp. I don't know if people know that. That's primarily what the colonists were doing, was hemp production. But they were not allowed to refine hemp in the colonies. They had to ship raw hemp back to England, where the fine production would be done, paper and other fabrics and things like that. That actually led to the tax revolt, guys. That actually, because the colonists wanted to do the refinement themselves and therefore make more profits, and they were refused by England, the Queen, from being allowed to refine the hemp themselves. They could only harvest that, cultivate and harvest. And that was the beginning of the anger of the colonists and farmers and businessmen against their home country. That's what led to the tax revolt, actually.
I really appreciate your ability for storytelling. The thing that you had mentioned to Matti and I in that discovery call was one of the value propositions you thought this podcast would have for listeners was that we could actually bring these kinds of conversations that would educate people into this modern society that we have, and where we're not necessarily getting deeper than the surface. So I think, like, I'm learning a lot, I'm taking a lot of notes, and I appreciate your ability to put so much into context. For our Wisdom Matrix community and our listeners, we've talked a lot about consciousness. It's a word that's being used a lot these days, but I'm not sure everybody has the same relative understanding or relationship or awareness around it. And so, just in kind of simplistic terms, through your lens and perspective, like, what is consciousness and how does that relate to awareness? Like, what's the difference between the two, or how do they relate? And in that experience for somebody?
Yeah, such a critical like baseline. And my first answer to anybody that would ask me that question is I could explain it to your computer brain, but it won't make any sense until you actually do the work yourself to go exploring. So I encourage every human being. It doesn't require intelligence to go discover your consciousness. Anybody can do it. My job and or my sense of purpose in life, as well as many people that preceded me, we're just map makers. I used to be a fan of Ken Wilber. I don't know if you guys know Ken Wilber. Profound guy, like everybody. If you're capable of digesting his stuff, he'll pop open portals in your mind to your next level of consciousness if you're able to stick with it. But something Ken Wilber came up with is like, hey, I'm not a teacher, I'm a map maker. Like I'm just one map of like infinite number of maps that have been made on this planet by other people, to show you the possible paths into consciousness, which really is a path into spirituality, into God, to the God mind. To me, if we are willing to go internally on this search, and these medicines can help us greatly help us, from starting from cannabis. Oh, before cannabis, I've learned that there are other medicines of profound effects on consciousness that you don't feel anything. I mean, you're talking about like flower essences have the power to open consciousness. So our understanding of medicine and consciousness is very deep and almost and it is infinite. But the map that I would encourage people to see that will help them begin their journey of discovery about consciousness is to realize that we can look at every aspect of reality. I'm simplifying it. It's much more than this, probably. But for me, the simplification is simply seeing that we are these layers of existence. There's this material layer. The material layer is literally the atoms and molecules that we're composed of. Okay. And so when we're talking about the brain and we're talking about receptors and neurons and signals going back between these little packets of units, like the way we would see a computer function, that's the material level of our consciousness. That's you and I making plans for dinner or how to pay our taxes and so on and so forth, how to have a career, so on and so forth. That's the one layer that we operate from. Unfortunately, in the Western world, and for at least 300, 400 years, we've been utterly dominated by and convinced that this layer is the only most important layer of consciousness to focus on. And this is where we raise our children to be hyper-focused on building their computers, because that will lead to money, nice cars, nice houses, luxury vacations. And so that's what it's all about. Don't worry about this other stuff. Of course, we know that there's this psycho-emotional layer of who we are. The psycho-emotional layer isn't necessarily, it is completely connected to and affected by the material level, the gut health and, compounds that are released that can make anxiety or not, and so on and so forth. So, okay, mind, body, we got that part. But then there's this other layer, this upper layer that we're also existing at. And that's really the mystery. That's the mystery that needs to be explored more deeply. But once you explore this mystery, you begin to see through all the layers. You have to see that as I'm interacting with you, or if just I'm interacting with myself, through meditation, through introspection, through doing medicine work, we can start separating out different minds that are operating in us at the same time. There's a computer running, which has tasks to do. There's a psycho-emotional being in there that's been influenced and affected by life and has onboarded triggers and traumas and other experiences from which it has its own kind of thinking and effect on us and our behavior. And then there's another, what we call the higher consciousness, the higher conscious mind, that we think is us. It may be us, I don't know. Our localized us, our localized consciousness, like I'm a musician, I'm a ceremonial musician. I play guitar in these ceremonies for hours and hours, and I receive inspiration, right? I receive inspiration. I play the guitar in a ceremony in ways where I never knew how to play it like that before. It just happened. And so I'm starting to see like, okay, well, that happens to all these famous musicians that I look up to and love. You know, Carlos Santana was one of my guitar heroes. And I remember an interview where, oh, you're the best, Carlos, and, you know, people love you. And he's like, man, you know, I can't take credit. I'm just a beam of light from the mind of God. So he's acknowledging he's a beam of light, but it's not coming from him. It's coming from some greater source. And I think that's the beginning of the exploration. Is like, who are we? What our consciousness is a beam. If we can see that beam of light from something greater, and you begin to meditate on that, and you begin to enter these deep conscious spaces using various medicines or no medicine at all, just meditation, we can start experiencing that, you know, what some people describe, or Ken Wilber might have said, the little mind and the big mind. There's a little mind here doing its thing that we think is us. And if we practice hard enough in a disciplined way, where we can actually begin to pull back and see our own minds in operation. And I think medicines help us do that. You know, cannabis was really one of the first medicines that helped me drop into this witness state, this awareness state. It's a state of no thinking, no analysis, no nothing, but just pure watching, you know, pure watching. And then, you know, I've had rare moments where I was just effortlessly in a state of just watching without analysis, but I could see myself thinking. I could see my operations happening, but I was in another mind. I was in a completely different mind. So to answer your question, I think that this is the beginning for everybody of questioning what consciousness is. And this, as you know, in the current quantum consciousness sciences, right? Like literally neurologic sciences, we're starting to believe, many theorists in the consciousness space are starting to believe that consciousness at its greatest level, at its largest level of our consciousness, is not something that we're actually generating from inside of this biological thing, but actually we're receiving consciousness from outside of us. You know, that we're a conductor of consciousness. We're an antenna of consciousness at the highest levels, comes into this, why don't we just call it like an artificial intelligent robot that receives instructions and has a very, very, very refined computer and AI system designed to like make it all run well and do things and accomplish all sorts of amazing tasks like landing rockets and all this stuff. Okay. But the inspiration, the visions, it's coming from a greater source potentially, right? Now we're like getting totally mystical because this is what the mystics have been saying for thousands of years. That's how it works. You know, if you look at any of the wisdom traditions of consciousness studies, the Hindus, the Buddhists, and even before them, the shamanic tribes are saying that we're receiving the consciousness from outside of us, into us, through us, and that we're vehicles for making those visions material in this particular plane, this particular three-dimensional, you know, 4 dimensions, because we're restricted by time as well, time and space. We're materializing consciousness, which is actually much greater than any of those dimensions.
I love that. I really love that. And I just would like to piggyback, because I think it's an important distinction and note. Many of the experiences you have described, for example, the 3D stars story, or the surfing rain story, or the horizon and ocean story with your dad. One of the yogic science teachers I follow, he's a huge fan of Dr. Ian McGilchrist, who is a neuroscientist who's made this distinction between left brain experiences and right brain experiences. And the left brain being linear and being the thinking, operating mind, and the right brain being that witnessing or spaciousness or deeper intelligence, expansiveness. And I think it's interesting how you described in one of your experiences, actually in multiple of them, you saw the stars, but not in a linear format. You saw it in a multi-dimensional reality, which would lend itself to this theory or idea or neurological concept that you were accessing your deep right brain, and therefore your perception shifted, in that deep absorption state was so profoundly impactful on your consciousness that it shifted your awareness from that point forward. At 10 years old, at 13 years old, you had these profound states. And for our listeners, just noting that type of experience as an absorption, which sometimes we don't necessarily have the words for. I was in a Buddhist meditation class one time, and I asked the teacher, I said, hey, what do you call these experiences that people are having? And he said, we call it absorption. And it's like somehow the neurological energy is absorbed deeper into the right brain, and then it creates a massive expansion of consciousness on some level. Do you have, from your experience and from a neurological basis, because I know you're integrating a lot from medicine work to consciousness to the medical side to quantum physics, like, do you see that the medicines are acting as a neurological driver specifically for inducing those states, and that is something that has become more easily accessible to you, like when you're playing music and that kind of thing?
Yeah, the answer is there's multiple layers of perspectives to that answer, quite honestly, right? Because if we just purely look at these compounds as these molecules going in and bumping up against receptors to produce experiences or perspectives, that's one layer. That's one layer of looking at that. Another way to look at it, Rick Strassman's famous book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule, which is the perspective of the indigenous cultures. The indigenous cultures, while they didn't have the benefit of, modern day science to analyze compounds and brain tissue and receptors to see what was happening on a material level, what they feel the actual relationship with these medicines in their perspective is actually a actual relationship between the plant's consciousness and our consciousness. If I flip it on us, right, from the Western mindset of like, okay, I smoke pot, I get this experience because I've got X percentage of CBD, the THC, the terpenes, blah, blah, blah. That's why I have this experience. Let's flip it to the indigenous perspective because it's a very fascinating one. It says, what you're doing is you're putting in another consciousness into your body, energetic consciousness. They don't care about the atoms and molecules and receptors. They're saying, regardless of what you think with your highfalutin science about compounds and so forth, what we see is we're actually taking the consciousness of this plant and we're putting it into our consciousness like a teacher. That's why they call them teachers. And the teacher opens your eyes to see things that you couldn't see before. And then you start learning things. And where this gets really fascinating, all right, and it's that, again, it's a deep meditation for each person to go explore and figure out for themselves, where's the line between the teacher plant coming into us and where is the knowledge coming from? How is the knowledge arising or arriving? And so Rick Strassman and many other people are saying, look, DMT, we can look at it in this analytical, scientific way, but we can also look at it as a key, a chemical key that unlocks a door, right? The Doors of Perception, which is a famous book, that it's actually unlocking some kind of doorway of consciousness into, let's just say, a vast library of knowledge. Okay. Having done medicine work for 2 decades, deeply and very seriously, and studying very deeply, I can help people shortcut a lot of the searching to say, look, the stuff that comes through is so profound and so accurate that for a long time, I've let go of any belief that I'm coming up with it with my own mind. It's so beyond my comprehension what has come through. There's no way. It's not coming from this brain. Not, even with my life and all my intelligence and all my learning, it did not come from that body of knowledge and experience. It definitely did not, because what I receive has been levels, levels, and levels deeper than that. Okay. If I want to take it further and blow people's minds a little bit more open, besides what is doing inside of my consciousness and what I become aware of, it gets really kind of incredible when you also see that level of study begins to ripple out into reality around you. What if I were to tell people, like, if you go down this road of studying consciousness and analyzing it and having a relationship, like you're literally in a relationship with this other being of some sort, okay, this other consciousness of some sort inside of your own mind, and then it starts to speak back to you. It starts to change and shift reality around you as a way of answering you or interacting with you or dancing with you. Having a relationship with you. Life is having a relationship with you in its own ways if you pay attention. And people say, oh, well, you're looking for an outcome, or you're filtering out your experiences so that you're looking for things to fulfill your whatever subconscious needs. And I'm like, yeah, okay, I get that. But the let's just say the coincidences, when they happen a few times, is one thing. When they're repeatedly happening hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times in reaction to your internal relationship or dialogue with this other consciousness, it becomes, let's just say, very interesting. And everybody has to go find out for themselves whether that's true or not.
Gorgeous. Thank you for that.
Yeah. So like this blanket of reality. So let's go down that map. Let's go down that map.
Yeah, let's go.
Let's say that we are. Let's use the constellation map as an example, right? Let's pretend that each of us is a sun out there, right, shining, and that's our individual appearing consciousness, right? We're all radiating an energy. Basically, we have a solid mass of consciousness that we possess. We own it, okay? And we get to be it. This is my star. That's who I am. You're over there, your star. If we actually change the perspective of like just very narrow visual frequency of light that we can perceive with our human eyes, what if we opened up to every single frequency that exists? There's no point in space that's actually dark. It's all full of energy and vibration everywhere. So the whole thing is a net of energy with concentrations of energy that in our regular eyes look like separate objects. This is quantum physics. I'm not making this up. This is quantum physics. This is how we describe all of material reality, is that we're just a massive sea of energetic vibration with concentrations that appear solid: planets, asteroids, suns, stars. We could use that map though for consciousness, because that's how consciousness appears to work. If you start digging it deeply and you start to using these medicines, it will show you in a very rapid fashion that we're in a sea of consciousness together. We can actually have our own consciousness and feel our own feelings, create our own feelings, but we can also feel other feelings radiating back at us, or that we can radiate feelings outwards or thoughts that have effects on people, right? This telepathy or ESP, or whatever we want to call it, which is real, by the way. The science is proven. It just hasn't been talked about enough. That we have this level of psychic interactions with each other. It's already proven. So that's really what our consciousness means. We're just a little pocket of consciousness in a sea of consciousness together. And so what if beyond the earth, what if we were to spread that consciousness outward? I've always felt like when I studied, when I was really into astronomy and all this, learning about the astrophysics and everything like that, and when I started learning the laws of physics, right, the basic laws of physics that makes our whole whatever galaxy operate or the universe operate, I said, I always felt like these basic laws that we're describing, aren't they just little tiny little units of the consciousness of this thing that we call God? Like God's got an operating system of how he wants, or she, or what it wants things to run. And it just needs to input energy into it, and it makes these things start running. These little pieces of machinery start running, but the machines have to run based on some basic laws, some basic rules, like the basic laws of thermodynamics. Okay, why is that rule there? Well, it's an operating system rule of how this thing operates. What if we were to scale that up infinitely? We're like a pretty scaled up version of the laws of thermodynamics is all we are. We just got layers and layers of other laws that are running the machinery that turns us into this. And then I can couple with another person and make another baby that's going to have the same operating principles, right? That's in our DNA, for example. So you can see that our consciousness, I always look at the question of spirituality and consciousness. I just look at the material world and the structure of it. And I say, it's the same structure. It's the same structure. We can extrapolate that consciousness is operating at a similar kind of structural paradigm, you know? As Ken Wilber, or before him, said, turtles all the way up and turtles all the way down. You know, this is, I think, a Buddhist concept. I think they have an artistic piece that says, like, you know, the infinite universe just replicates itself infinitely larger and infinitely smaller. You know, fractal, you know, the concept of fractalness, which is like everything is embedded into everything else fully at all times.
Maybe this is a good segue into kind of what you're focusing on now, like pouring into the world, and obviously bringing a lot of this knowledge to you know, to people who are seeking it and starting to open up, right, and really diving into these topics. And so maybe catch us up on what you're offering to the world now. And I know you're down in Costa Rica and doing some amazing things, and so would love to share that with our audience.
Well, you know, I think I've shared a lot of like my personal journey in life. I didn't get into the really like dark stuff that I went through, but I think it's worth mentioning for a brief moment, which is the ego, you know, success, money. That, you know, coming from the background I came from, that was the Holy Land, right? The hedonism land, you know, of like enjoying life, coming from poverty and difficulties, and going deeply into that, and getting a full taste of that, and blowing myself out, and blowing out my relationship, and destroying things around me, and making my life personally really miserable. And it was so necessary, you know? So if anybody is like on this podcast because they've gone through hardship and it's what's opening them up to even trying these medicines or going down this path, it's like, I applaud you, because this is one of the spiritual formulas that's necessary. This need to go into the valley of darkness of our soul, right? Because when you really suffer, when you really go into the depths of suffering, whether it's yours or somebody else's, there's a fuel that comes into your soul that breaks down all the falsities and all the indoctrination around a material existence. And it's essentially taking us into our heart, which is, to me, the most important part of our consciousness, actually, is the heart consciousness. The analytical consciousness is, like I said, it's overly exemplified and domineering in our Western culture, and not enough on a heart intelligence. The heart intelligence is a profound topic in itself. It's where I now try to center my whole conscious existence on, is this concept of the heart intelligence, which doesn't seek to control, dominate the outcome of my life. The heart intelligence is now reading the space, reading my life, reading whatever I'm doing from a perspective of really being at service to my consciousness and the purpose that it's giving me, right? Not me creating for myself, but it is giving me by giving me a feeling of passion, a feeling of compassion, a feeling of wanting, you know, with all my being and with joy. You know, it's cliche. It's like, oh, do what you love. I mean, that's an old cliche, but man, until you fully understand that as a human being, what it feels like to have that belief, it, it it's something everybody, you know, if you haven't experienced that for yourself, you should go experience it, even if you have to go through some really challenging, dark times in your life, because the opening of that consciousness, to me, is the real gateway into a profound state of existence and a profound sense of purpose. And so I'll start with that. That's
Amen.
that's my mission
Yeah.
statement. Let's
There
just
you
say
go.
that's my mission statement for what I'm doing, you know, because after 20 years of drinking medicine and doing all sorts of ceremonies, and going through the healing myself, I did a lot of personal healing for 10 years. It was all about me. It was all about like clearing out a lot of stuff that I was carrying, a lot of crying, a lot of purging, a lot of misery, a lot of dark challenges in my personal life outside of ceremony before I surrendered, you know. Once I gave up my desire to be in control of my life's outcome and what I want to get from life, once I gave that up completely, not just intellectually, but from a deep heart perspective, a feeling perspective, giving up control and giving it up, like they say, give it up to God. I so believe in that, you know, because from that moment, from the moment, it took me 10 years of beating the demand for control out of myself before I really got a taste of what it's like to be in this state of consciousness where you're at service to this consciousness. And it speaks to you through your heart, not through your mind. You know, the mind is tricky because that computer brain's always right there with you. And the computer brain is where the ego resides. Being in tune to like the impulses of a feeling that's not about pleasure, you know, it's a different feeling. We have to separate that. Pleasure is a physical and lower level psycho-emotional, whereas peace and happiness, or bliss is this very different thing, that I hope everybody gets to experience at least once in their life. And that impulse, that's the higher intelligence that will guide you even when it seems impossible. Like you don't know where your next paycheck's going to come from. You don't know how you're going to make it through next month, next year. Once you can surrender, truly surrender, and it's a very complex conversation, you will be on a quite an interesting journey after that. And so that's the where I am today is a personal journey of self-discovery and self-healing and climbing out of some really dark holes personally to continue this work of exploring my consciousness using medicine, using meditation, using prayer, using various forms of practice. Musicianship is a form of spiritual practice that started manifesting in my own life as my dialogue, my dance with consciousness, that I started sharing with other people in ceremony, because I spent many of my years as a guardian, you know, as a facilitator in ceremonies to help people who are coming in for the first time and confronting all their darkness and all their stuff for the first time and really suffering inside the ceremonies, outside the ceremonies, and giving them some advice about how to keep it together and not destroy their life while they're going through this growth stage. That was how I started. And as the work continued, um, and, you know, we were doing this underground for all these years, you know, out of fear, but completely believing in what we were doing, you know, defying the laws, putting ourselves at risks, um, waiting for the moment that there would be enough mass of people awakened enough to say, screw your rules. I'm entitled as a sovereign being to my own consciousness. I am entitled to explore my own consciousness in the way I want to explore my consciousness. If I blow my brain out because of some harmful drug, that's my fault, you know? But every human being is entitled to explore their consciousness. Nobody has a right to come in and reach into your mind and say, you cannot experience that ever. I don't give you permission. That time's over. You know, I think there's still a domineering consciousness on this planet that's very fixated on the material level, basic psycho-emotional level of domination over other people's minds. They're desperately hanging on because once that the shift is already happening, and once the shift really takes form, all of humanity is radically going to shift in the way we interact with each other, in the way we govern each other, the way we take care of each other will radically change the paradigm, once that pyramid top on down kind of control over consciousness is destroyed. That's basically what's happening. It's not being destroyed in a violent way at all. It's just being destroyed because people like us are choosing to regain sovereignty of our consciousness, the rights to our own mind, the rights to our own spirit, the rights to our own discoveries for ourselves, and not being told what to believe anymore. You know, that's the purest expression of like my experience, for example, in the particular medicine tradition that I like to practice on a regular basis, which is to like blow out all the stories, have a direct communion with God or higher consciousness yourself, and then make your own decisions about what that's about. Stop this. Don't listen to the stories, from other people or the history. And so my project down in Costa Rica, my project Lotus Mind, obviously the lotus grows from decay. This beautiful thing grows from decay. And I'm describing in a very, grateful way what has been happening for me as a person to come from such darkness and such difficulty to find this flower that has been flowering. And I just, I have the greatest desire to help people who are going through that, to take that material instead of it destroying you, instead of you needing to reach out for numbing experiences, instead of dopamine hits of like sex, power, money, control, whatever, and realize that we can take that material and work with it in a way that transforms you into this newer, higher version that is waiting. It's not something you have to actually acquire. It's actually something you're uncovering inside of yourself.
Right.
That's what's cool.
It's always there.
You don't have to go out there and get it. You don't have to go out there and get it into you. It's already inside of you. That's the cool part. It's like the keys are already inside. You just have to go find the key. And it's going to take some adventuring. And sometimes the adventures get hard and painful. But that's what it's going to take. You have to earn that key. You have to earn the key.
Amazing. And what does that look like? So, like, take us to Costa Rica. Is it a physical place experience? You having people coming down? How are you working with them? Maybe just kind of the logistics of the experience that you're bringing to people, or you're bringing people into.
Yeah, Costa Rica Lotus Mind Retreats is really the culmination, the start, is the beginning of the publicly announced ceremonies that we're doing and offering, and it's built on all these things I've described to you. I've got a network of really incredible practitioners that are more advanced than I am, that I've actually learned from them. They're my teachers, and we've been doing this work underground for all these years, waiting for the moment that we could step out and do it in our own way, in our particular perspective and paradigm of how consciousness operates at these multiple levels. We're certainly not the only retreats. We're offering this full holistic model of consciousness, everything from the material and having a good grasp of the material, the medical safety, the sciences. We can go toe to toe with all the other doctors and scientists that talk about this subject. And we can go toe to toe with all the psychotherapists and psychologists that talk about the concept of mental functioning. And we're bringing in the wisdom traditions of these ancient technologists, right? People look at these indigenous people living in their villages and stuff in the Amazon and these humble places in the East Asian areas. They're not very advanced modern people, but my gosh, the technology, the sophisticated quantum technology that they have learned and passed on to each other is so profound that we have a lot there to work with for lifetimes. And so bringing those wisdom experiences from these elders, from these ancient traditions in to that whole package, and actually that being the center from which we practice our ceremonies, giving people a full sense of like physical safety. Their bodies, their minds will be safe in our hands. Their psychological safety will be safe in our hands. Upper level dimension, which is important to speak about if you do dig deep into this. If you accept that we are in this network of consciousness, just like I can send a harmful word in your direction verbally through vibration that's going to affect you in a negative way, or something positive, well, we can do this with our minds towards each other without speaking a word as well. That's just reality. People have to accept that, if they're willing to travel this road of consciousness, that our minds are very powerful in transmitting and receiving good or bad frequency vibrations, let's say, from each other's consciousness. And so when we begin to talk about medicine work and so on and so forth, this is what I said to somebody, a client recently. I said, picking which ceremonies and which shaman or whoever you're going to receive medicine from and be vulnerable to in a medicine, which is a consciousness experience. I said, you ought to think about it like, who are you picking is the neurosurgeon that's going to open up your brain and operate on your brain. It's that serious, in my opinion, because in the wrong hands, bad things have happened to people, not just physically, but psycho-emotionally and potentially spiritually. If you listen to the elders, the elder traditions, the indigenous cultures, they say, yeah, they're very, very risky. Who you drink medicine with, who you take medicine from, be very careful. And it's not obvious on the outside. And so, that's the full scope paradigm that we operate from is greatly, and by the way, that concept of like this risk of dark or positive forces in the consciousness work, that's not just because we're taking words from these elders and these indigenous people. We're going and exploring that for a long time ourselves to see if that's true. And it's very, very true. And so there's a significant thing there because, we've been watching for 20 years the explosion of ayahuasca shamanism from Peru. It went from a, highly, sacred experience that foreigners were going down for, and it became highly monetized for the past 10 years. And highly commercial, and all the problems started manifesting from there. And then, of course, waves and waves of people going down and drinking for a while and coming back and saying, oh, I'm a shaman now because I got trained by this guy and I'm going to do ceremonies. And we've seen and experienced a lot of people spreading quite a lot of, let's just say, spiritual illness around by not actually having done their own work before they started guiding people on the work. I'm not trying to say that to scare people. I'm just telling you the actual realities if you actually monitor what's happening in that space. So, again, pick your ceremonies like you would pick a brain surgeon is what I would encourage people to do. You have to have discernment. You have to ask, in my opinion, ask the question of like, are these people, whoever it is, my friend's going to give me some mushrooms and we're going to eat, and what are the levels at each level of themselves, or the person that you're going to entrust yourself to, how knowledgeable, what perspectives do they have about these various levels that I'm describing? Do they have enough understanding of material? Do they have enough understanding of the psycho-emotional? Do they have any concept of another level, which is this higher consciousness, energetic consciousness, quantum consciousness, understanding of what they're working with when they put these keys that are opening portals in your mind? In the ayahuasca tradition, as when you drink with a shaman, his kind of teaching, or the teaching from that tradition, is like, it's like walking into the jungle, and you want to have a good guide because there's some amazing things to see and there's dangers. And so the guide is there to protect you from the dangers while showing you, all the various experiences and teachings. And so that guidance has to have a lot of integrity inside of it, because you certainly don't want to discover later on that the guide himself was a dangerous animal in the jungle waiting for you to arrive. And so that's something we always want to look at, and it's a fine discernment.